Now, with the fall of the first empires, we enter a watershed moment in Chinese history. We know this as the Great Southern Migration. What we're talking about here is the period of about the first millennium AD. The Han Dynasty falls in roughly 200 AD, and until from about 200 AD to 1000 AD, a period of around 800 years. We get some pretty big shifts here. With the fall of the Han Dynasty, really with the fall of the first empires, there are successive dynasties, very confusing, complex mix of dynasties throughout northern China, southern China, and whatnot. There are some larger ones, but again, we don't want to follow necessarily the dynastic cycle framework of Chinese history. We want to talk about broader themes and emphasize change and some continuity over time. To always remember that Chinese history is dynamic and ever evolving, just like any other part of the world. So the Great Southern Migration, a period of about 800 years from 200 to 1000 AD. This is a period that's going to see some pretty seismic shifts in demography, culture, the economy, and politics. So let's touch upon some of these, perhaps as a subset of culture. Let's talk about religion. We haven't talked about really religion yet. We've talked a little bit about ancestor worship, the Chinese conception early on that the afterlife was really a carbon copy of your actual life, at least the surviving graves from the elites who wanted to preserve their perks in the next life. Maybe the commoners thought differently, but the elites seemed to want to take everything with them, whether it was real human sacrifices or whether it was terracotta substitutes for the things they wanted to take with them. The afterlife seemed to be a carbon copy of this life, and that was the expectation. This time period, during the Great Southern Migration, when you get enormous populations of Chinese from the north, the Yellow River Valley, fleeing, migrating to the southern Yangzi River regions and further south than that, this is the time when Buddhism is also going to really make its chief inroads into East Asia from India and import a radically different view of the afterlife. The Chinese view of the afterlife will not be completely displaced and eliminated by Buddhism. It will simply become sort of like a syncretic version in which some ideas about the Chinese afterlife are just going to merge with Buddhist ideas as well. But what Buddhism's going to do is it's going to make the afterlife a lot more exciting, a lot more dramatic. There's going to be new heavens and hells, which we don't have any evidence that the Chinese were thinking of heavens and hells prior to this period. Buddhism is going to have heavens and hells, the heavens you aspire to, the hells you want to avoid. How do you determine whether or not you get into one or the other? Well, karma. Karma, essentially, is going to moralize the afterlife. Things you do in this life will have consequences in your next life in the process of Buddhist transmigration. So you have to do good things in this life to have a better rebirth in the next life, and eventually be able to enter one of the wonderful, beautiful, gorgeous, luxuriant Buddhist heavens. If you don't, you're going through the Buddhist hells. And we can see that this is a syncretic mix because you'll get sort of Chinese ideas that the afterlife has it kind of resembles a Chinese bureaucracy. There's different courts presided over by Chinese judges with Buddhist deities in these courts as well. And you have to pass through these hell courts that are a mix of Chinese ideas and Buddhist ideas of the afterlife until they determine whether or not you're going to be reborn in a more positive form, a less positive form, a heaven, you're going to go into hell, whatever it might be. They're judging your karmic merit. Another form of syncretism is that karma is going to be something that merges with ancestor worship and filial piety. The idea that you can accrue positive or negative karma not only for yourself, but for people who are dead. Well, that's going to be positive karma. You're not going to accumulate negative karma for someone who is dead. Your parents die and you want to make sure that they have a good rebirth or they enter the Buddhist heaven. You can do pious deeds, sponsor a local Buddhist monastery to get positive karma merit on their behalf that goes to them and assist them in their next afterworld journey. Chinese religion and art will be populated by Buddhist gods as well. The bodhisattvas, the Buddhas, the heavens and whatnot. It is a total revolution in Chinese thought, Chinese art, Chinese culture when Buddhism comes in during this time period. So again, another big discontinuity throughout Chinese history, showing that the China of the early years is much different than later. Heck, in the Shang Dynasty, Confucius hasn't even been born. There is no Buddhism either. All right. The other thing that's going to happen during the Great Southern Migration, now we can talk about demography and the economy. Overpopulation in the Yellow River Valley area and endemic warfare with the fall of the Han Dynasty are both going to encourage mass exodus for the south. Chiefly originally the Yangzi River drainage basin, which ends pretty much today, for reference point, in the area generally of Shanghai, although Shanghai wasn't a big city in the old days. But I mean, the eastern terminus of the Yangtze River, some of its mid-reaches as well. And then beyond that, they're just going to continue going down to the south until they reach the South China Sea, the area of current-day Hong Kong today. Now, to give you an idea of the scope of this demographic shift, it is incredible. In the year zero, halfway through the first Han Empire, the South had less than 25% of all the population that we would think of as being part of the Chinese cultural sphere, under the control of the Han Empire. By 589, about 600 years later, 40%, almost half of the population is in the South. And by the year 1200, this is an incredible number, 85%. That's 85 and percentage point sign. 85% of the population that is ruled over by the empire in 1200, that's going to be the Song Empire, the Song Dynasty, is in the South. That's a stunning demographic shift with lots of consequences. In the South, these northern migrants will encounter a very new environment with very new flora and fauna, much more tropical in the south. It's a lot wetter down there, and it's a lot more mountainous. This is going to lead to several major developments. The encounter with new flora will lead to the development of the Chinese garden. You haven't really had the classic Chinese garden yet. It develops during the first millennium AD by northern migrants who go to the south, and if you get wealthy and whatnot and you have an estate, you will tame this new, unfamiliar, wild nature by domesticating it in your own garden with artificial hills, artificial streams, and all the plant life and whatnot that you're encountering. You tame it in a domesticated garden where you can have civilized afternoon tea with other gentlemen. So you're going to get the development of the Chinese garden during the Great Southern Migration. You're also going to get the rise of intensive rice agriculture. This is a common misperception about Chinese history, that it's always been rice-based from the very beginning. In fact, people in the north have often, and to this day, have a very different diet than people in the south. Originally, they didn't eat a whole lot of rice in the north. It was much more millet and sorghum and grains, and they make it into sort of like bread-type products, baozi and these sorts of things, mantos. And in the south, this is where rice culture takes off when you get the northern migrants to the south. They encounter very wet, hilly, mountainous regions where the environment is perfect for rice strains that are imported from Southeast Asia. They actually come north, I believe, from what is now modern-day Thailand, Laos, and Vietnam, imported to what becomes southern China, and then take off from there. This will make for very wealthy landlords and very weak states in the south. You will have multiple dynasties in the south during this time and later. The south will always be politically weaker than the north, but it will also have a lot more money, a lot more agricultural wealth, and a much larger population to tax. So you get the shift in which military and political power will often be in the north because they are closer to the nomads, the Mongols, the Manchus, the Tabgach, the Khitan, the Tanguts. These are all different types of northern nomadic or semi-nomadic peoples who have the military advantage of being on horseback and being able to do lightning strikes and running away. They'll often ally with northern military families to conquer the south, because the south is where all the wealth, where all the subjects are, where all the tax revenue can be. And increasingly with that wealth, the Southerners will also be sort of the most culturally sophisticated as well. The center of Chinese learning, Chinese scholarship will move to the south. All these little towns, Suzhou, Yangzhou, Nanjing in the Yangtze River Delta region. They're going to be the preeminent centers of scholarship. There's a little irony here because all the major philosophers, all the major events of early Chinese classical history, the Zhou dynasty, the philosophers, that all took place in the north, in the Yellow River Valley area. Now the center of Chinese culture and civilization and sort of, scholarship is in the south. Studying the texts that were once produced in the north before the shift south. And so you get these massive, huge estates, very wealthy, in which the landlords have a lot of their own political power, and they undermine the power of any sort of dynasty that arises in the south. But military power rests in proximity to nomads who recurrently come south and conquer southern China and incorporate it into their own much larger, what we might call a hybrid state. Okay, so the South will become a big fat sitting duck for the more militarily powerful Northerners. All right, and not just any Northerners, nomads, semi-nomads. There's actually no such thing as a true 100% nomad. There's always some form of a sedentary existence involved, usually in winter. Sometimes they grow crops and have a mixed economy, but nevertheless. Nomads and mixed nomadic Northern Chinese military alliances will use their consistently superior military power to strike south and conquer the Yangzi River area, because that's where all the wealth is. That's where all the bureaucratic talent, cultural sophistication, and scholarship is. You want to legitimize yourself as someone who is fit to rule over a Confucian world order. You need to incorporate the Yangtze River Delta area. You need to co-opt those southern elites and their knowledge and and all their scholarship into your political organization to show, hey, I patronize the best Confucian scholars as well. I'm not just an uncouth barbarian. So from this point forward, sort of the midway point of the Great Southern Migration, this is going to be an astonishing number for any of you who are unfamiliar with Chinese history, and I've always thought about it, as one dynasty after another. China's been China forever. About half of all the major states from this point forward, the next 1,500 years until the modern era, are going to be conquered wholly or in part, substantial part, by Mongols, Manchus, Tabgach, Khitan, Tangut, those northern zone nomads. They're either going to conquer entirely or in concert with their allies. First northern China and then southern China. Southern China is always harder to conquer. It takes longer, but they eventually oftentimes will do it. The Mongol Yuan dynasty is going to be the largest one ever, although it doesn't last as long. For both durability and size, the Manchu Qing Empire from 1644 to 1911 is going to be the largest and most sophisticated of all of these. That's why all the major capitals in Chinese history are in the north. That's why the Great Wall was built in the north. It was an attempt to manufacture a barrier where nature had not given you a barrier. The northern part of China is what is known geographically as an exposed zone. Lots of flat areas that are very conducive to nomads coming in with their cavalry and overrunning the place. That's why it's going to be a bit harder to conquer the south. The south is what's known as a protected zone. But nevertheless, after the nomads come in and conquer the south, they will connect the two. North and South China will be distinct regions in many ways, demographic, cultural, culinary, economic, political, but they will be linked by the creation of what's known as the Grand Canal. The Grand Canal will essentially link the eastern stretches of the Yangtze River to the eastern stretches of the Yellow River and make it possible for political power to remain in the north while harnessing and controlling the economic wealth of the south. One last point to note, which is very important, is that the northerners, the northern hybrid states composed of people who were originally non-Chinese and then sort of partly adopted Chinese customs, patronized Confucian scholarship, learned Chinese, but also retained their own non-Chinese original identities and took pride in those identities. They will also undertake the majority of the ethnic classification work in Chinese history. You think the Chinese have been Chinese forever? Well, no. As we saw before, Chinese is a cultural term, huaxia, what the philosophers talked about. Chinese is cultural. It's not racial. This means anyone who patronizes or adopts the practices of the Confucian scholars, reads the Confucian text, talks about proper ritual and virtue and all that, can be a Confucian ruler, even if you're not what we might think of as racially Chinese. And so they'll come up with new terms to distinguish between culturally Chinese rulers, culturally Chinese subjects, but with a different ethnic identity. Most people don't realize that the ethnic identity of Han, the ethnic label of Han, was created by northern nomads. It was the Tabgach dynasty it was the Tabgach people who created the Northern Way Dynasty. In the beginning centuries of the Great Southern Migration, the Northern Way Dynasty, ruled chiefly by Tabgach, were the first to say, we think we're Chinese and civilized. You guys are Chinese and civilized, are subjects, but we still want to distinguish between us. So we're going to retain another term for us. We are the Tabgach, And you need another term to distinguish you. We need a subset of labels within the definition of Chinese culture, Chinese civilization. So they created the term Han. They took it from the recently fallen Han Empire and said, that's going to be your term. And the term Han was created by non-Han peoples, essentially to distinguish between two or more different types of people who could be considered civilized, but were also both Chinese, yet distinctly civilized in different ways. The northern hybrid rulers with their dual Chinese cultural identity and their Mongol or Manchu identity, and then the subjects who are going to be, yes, you're culturally Chinese, ethnically you are Han. And that's going to be the beginning of the different types of ethnic identities that we see in China as well. Han will undergo many shifts in meaning over the next 1,500 years until it finally becomes stable and refers to what we think of as Han today, which is essentially synonymous with a racial version of the term Chinese. It'll assume that definition sometime during the Ming Dynasty, 1368 to 1644.